Today we'll be learning about how to write a fairy tale. Some essential questions for our lesson will be, what is a fairy tale? How do I know I'm reading a fairy tale? And what tools will I use when I write my own fairy tale? So let's look at some examples of fairy tales. From the book 50 Famous Fairy Tales, published by the Whitman Publishing Company out of Racine, Wisconsin. We have stories like Cinderella and Jack the Giant Killer, Puss in Boots, Tom Thumb, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, The Golden Goose, Rapunzel, Rumpelstiltskin, and we also have some examples that you can find just online, some pictures. This one's of Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf. This one is of Snow White. And here's a collection. Looks like Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella, Peter Pan, Snow White, Alice in Wonderland, and Pinocchio. And these are two other resources that we're using. The next one is the one that we'll be using to learn how to write a fairy tale. Once Upon a Time, Writing Your Own Fairy Tale, by Nancy Lowen and illustrated by Christopher Lyles. Picture Window Books Publishing Company in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Go through the copyrights. A goose lays golden eggs, a frog turns into a prince, and a magic beanstalk grows high into the clouds, where a giant lives. What kind of stories are these? Fairy tales, of course. Fairy tales are very old stories with magical characters. Every culture has its own fairy tales. When the stories were formed, few people could read or write. The tales were spoken out loud. Let's take a close look at Little Red Riding Hood, and you'll see how the right tools can help you write your own fairy tale. Tool 1 is the setting. The setting is the time and the place of the story. In a fairy tale, the setting is made up of stories. The stories happen in distant past, and the place might be imaginary forest, village, or castle. No real time or place is described, but the setting of Little Red Riding Hood is a faraway forest long ago. You can pause at any time to read the actual story, but I'm just going to show you the tools, and then we're going to use those tools based off Little Red Riding Hood to make our own fairy tale. Two more tools. Number 2, the characters. The characters are often people or creatures in the story. The main character is the one who appears most often in the story. This fairy tale, Little Red Riding Hood, is the main character. Tool 3 is the plot. The plot is what happens in the story. Fairy tales, plots move quickly. We don't learn much about Little Red Riding Hood, or her mother, or her grandmother. Instead, the action begins right away. Tool 4 is dialogue. Dialogue is what characters say to each other. Good dialogue moves the story along. It gives the reader information. Tool 5, warnings. In fairy tales, characters often get warnings, like the one given here by Little Red Riding Hood's mother. Warnings give the reader clues about what might happen later in the story. Tool 6 is magic. All fairy tales contain magic. That is one thing that sets them apart from other old stories. Fairy tales can be about witches, giants, trolls, elves, and animals. They can be about kings and queens, princes and princesses. Objects such as mirrors or clocks can come to life. And yes, fairy tales can be about fairies too. Tool 7 is about greed. Fairy tales often have characters who are filled with greed. These characters want something that someone else has. They will do anything to get it. Here, the wolf wants an extra big lunch. That means there's trouble ahead for Little Red Riding Hood. Tool 8 is about tricks. Fairy tale characters often use tricks to fool each other. Little Red Riding Hood wants to do the right thing, but the wolf gets her thinking about flowers. She ignores her mother's warnings and runs off to the field. The wolf's plan works perfectly. Tool 9. In many good fairy tales, the reader knows a secret, something that the characters don't. Little Red Riding Hood has no idea that the wolf is in her grandmother's bed, but we do. Tool 10 is repetition. The repetition of words or action gives them more power. Using nearly the same words, Little Red Riding Hood notices the wolf's ears, then eyes, then teeth. The suspense builds. When the wolf jumps out of the bed, the little girl is frightened, and so are we. Tool 11 is about mistakes. In fairy tales, greedy characters often make mistakes. These mistakes can lead to their downfall. What would have happened if the wolf hadn't taken a nap? Tool 12 is for problem solving. In some fairy tales, problem solving happens through luck or magic. That's what happens in this story. The hunter comes along at just the right time and stops the evil wolf. Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother get out of trouble through luck. In other fairy tales, characters get out of trouble on their own. They solve their problem by being brave, strong, or clever. And the last tool we have is a pleasing ending. Fairy tales come to pleasing endings. They sometimes close with, and they lived happily ever after. The reader is left with the idea that nothing bad will happen to those characters ever again. A quick review of the tools. Fairy tales take place in made-up times and places, or settings. They usually begin once upon a time and have good and bad characters. A fairy tale plot moves quickly. Actions are more important than details. Dialogue between characters often includes warnings. Fairy tales include magic. A wolf blows down a house made of sticks, a gingerbread cookie comes to life, a fairy godmother turns mice into horses. The bad characters in a fairy tale are often filled with greed. They use tricks to get what they want. The reader often knows a secret, information the characters don't. Repetition of words or actions can build suspense. Bad characters usually make mistakes that lead to their downfall. Good characters solve their problem on their own or through luck or magic, bringing the fairy tale to a pleasing ending. Now we are going to use the example of Little Red Riding Hood to create our own fairy tale. So we start with the setting, which we start off our story with once upon a time, or long ago in a magical something, and since we're going to use this as an example, we're going to use our classroom. So, long ago in a magical classroom, moving on to the characters, there lived a turtle named Rusty, a goldfish, and an evil lawn gnome. The plot, what's going to happen in our story? Well, the gnome is going to trick Rusty into playing hide-and-go-seek in the garden. And the gnome goes to the fish tank and eats the goldfish and hides to eat Rusty. The dialogue and warnings. We will have Goldfish give Rusty some warnings, and this is what one of them will sound like. Don't go into the magical garden, Rusty, said the goldfish, and don't talk to strangers. The magic that we'll be using. We're going to use talking animals and a garden gnome that comes to life. Greed, our next tool. The lawn gnome is going to be greedy because he wants to eat the goldfish and Rusty when he has all the food that he needs in his magical garden. Tricks. The lawn gnome will trick Rusty into playing hide-and-go-seek, and then he'll hide in the fish tank to eat Rusty after eating the goldfish. The secret. We're going to know the lawn gnome's whole plan about hiding and tricking and eating the goldfish and Rusty. And repetition. When Rusty gets back to the fish tank where he lives, he will use these repetitions. Goldfish, are you hiding under the log? Goldfish, are you hiding behind the rock? Goldfish, are you hiding under the gnome hat? And that is when our reader will be filled with suspense because they'll know what's coming next. The mistakes. The gnome, after being greedy and eating both the goldfish and Rusty the turtle, his stomach will be so big that as he's walking across the bottom of the fish tank to leave, he'll trip over the log. When he trips, he's going to fall onto a rock and break into 1,000 pieces. The problem solving and pleasing ending. Our problem solving is going to be based off of luck, just like the story we just read. And the goldfish and Rusty will pop out of the gnome's stomach when he breaks into 1,000 pieces, and they will live happily ever after. The end.